and welcome back to the Earn Your Badge from Home program. Today y'all are going to be earning your third Coding for Good badge by building a project using JavaScript and HTML. Today we're going to be focusing on a new topic such as objects, and we'll talk more about those in a second, but we're also going to be reviewing some older things that we've worked on in previous projects like variables and loops. So let's see what we're actually going to be building today. So let's take a look at the project that y'all are going to be building today. So if you guys are familiar with BuzzFeed quizzes, we're kind of going to be doing the same thing. We're going to have the user answer a few questions about themselves and in turn give them what quote-unquote season represents their personality. So to start off, we're going to just hit run so our code begins running, and then I'm going to click on Start Quiz. And then off the bat, the user gets a question that says, choose an outdoor activity. And then they either type in 1 if they want snowboarding, they type in the number 2 for apple picking, and then 3 and 4, so on. So I'm going to choose 3, and then I'm going to hit OK. So my next question appears. What kind of weather do you prefer? So here, out of these, I'm going to pick 3 again. Next one, choose a sport. I'm going to choose volleyball, so I'm going to type in 2. And here's my last question, choose a food. I'm going to pick 3 again. All right, so I'm going to hit OK, and I got summer as my result. So that means summer is what represents who I am. So I'm going to hit OK. And then the last portion to this is my answers that I typed in are going to be displayed on the screen underneath. So we can see that I chose mostly 3s, and that's how I ended up getting summer. So let's see how we're actually going to build this now. All right, so this is what your screen should be looking like right now. As you can see in your template, I've already loaded for you the 4 images you're going to need, so you don't have to take the time to go through the internet and find images that represent winter, fall, spring, and summer. But we still clearly have a lot left to do. So for starters, let's just get everything looking the way it's supposed to, get a header on there, as well as that button that actually allows the user to start the quiz. So to add a header, I'm going to go into my HTML section. Here, let me make this a little larger for y'all. And then I'm going to, at the beginning of line 1, place my cursor there and then hit enter a few times. And then I'm going to place my header tag. So remember, when we do this, we want to find that less than symbol, say H1, and then find the greater than symbol. And then our tag automatically finishes for us. So anything in between these two pieces of code is going to have very large font, and it's going to be bolded. And that property is going to apply to whatever text I place between these two. So here I'm going to say, which season are you? Kind of to create some sort of title. And now when I hit run, I have that automatically appearing here. And so now what we're going to do is add that button. So now I'm going to the very bottom. Now, the reason we're doing this is, remember, everything in HTML appears in the order that which you place it. So if I want my header to be above all my images, I got to place my code for my header above the code for my images. So here, since I want my button below my images, I'm going to now place my button code at the very end. Okay, so to do this, let's create our button tag. So we get something looking like some sort of square on the screen that we can click on. And then we are actually going to come back to this to make it actually do something, but for now, let's just make it look the way it's supposed to. So any text that I place between my opening and closing tag for button is what's going to now display on top of said button. So here I'm going to say start quiz. So let's zoom out, let me hit run. And there's my start quiz button. All right, so now let's get this actually working. Let's get it asking our user some questions. So basically, what's going to happen with this game, the way we're going to structure it to figure out which user's answers relate to which season, is we're basically going to determine, if you've ever played any of those like quizzes that they place in like magazines and stuff, we're just going to say all of our 1s, like any answer choice that is 1 is going to represent winter. And any answer choice where they have to type in 2 is going to represent fall. And then 3 is going to represent summer, and 4 is going to represent spring. So with all of our questions, that's how our answer choices have to reflect that we give them. So all of the choices that they can have for one are going to be winter related things. So our first question that we're going to ask the user is, what kind of outdoor activity would you prefer? So to do that, we're going to type in prompt so that the question actually gets displayed to the user and that they have an opportunity to type something else in. So I'm going to say choose an outdoor activity. And I'm going to say 1, snowboarding. That's my winter-esque thing. And then for 2, I'm going to say apple picking, something for fall. 3 is going to be going to the beach for summer. And then 4 is gardening. Okay, so now I have my question being asked, but I want to also store whatever my user's answer is and use that in other places. So I'm going to say var activity. By creating some sort of variable, remember a variable is a place for us to store some sort of piece of information. Here, the piece of information that we're storing is whatever number that the user types in. So feel free to take a second, hit run, and see our first box appear. So here I can type in 2 and then hit OK, or you can hit the enter key on your keyboard. It doesn't make a difference, but nothing big happens, but our question does get asked, which is good. So now let's do that for our other 4 questions real quick. Sorry, our other 3 questions. So next let's ask them what kind of weather do they prefer. So here I'm just going to create my variable off the bat because I know I'm going to want to store this answer. So I'm going to say var weather, storing it in a variable titled weather. So when I want to access whatever they typed in for weather, all I have to do is type in the word weather to access the variable. So I'm going to say prompt, and then here we should say, what kind of weather do you prefer? 1, snow. Again, follows the winter theme. 2, partly cloudy and mild. 3, sunshine and hot. Oh goodness. 4, rain. To go with spring. Now my next one is going to have to do with, I'm going to have my user choose a sport, and that's going to have to do with figuring out which season represents them. So we're going to say var, this time store it in a variable that says sport. I'm going to say prompt, and then I'm going to say what sport, or let's say choose a sport. And then here I'm going to say 1, basketball, because that's a winter sport. 2, volleyball. 3, cross country. 4, lacrosse. And then our last one's going to be food. So I'm going to say store it inside of a variable that says food, and I'm going to say prompt, choose a food. And then 1 is going to be hot soup. 2 is going to be pumpkin pie. 3 is going to be watermelon. And 4 is going to be salad. Okay, so we got our 4 questions asked. So let me hit run a few times so we can see everything. So there's my first question. I'm just going to type in 1 for now. There's my second question. Third. And fourth. Okay, so we got all our questions asking. Now, the big part with this is going to be taking in that information and trying to determine which number they typed in the most in order for them to get some sort of output for which quote-unquote season they are. So how we're going to essentially start off this process is we're going to count how many times a certain number is inputted. So we're going to essentially create 4 variables, and each one is in charge of incrementing every time that a specific number is added. For example, if I create a variable called one count, I'm going to do it on line 1. I'm going to say var one count equals 0. It's just starting out at 0. Every time that the user types in 1, this variable's job is to increase by 1. So then by the end of it, say they typed in 1 4 times, this variable will be equal to 4 because it's holding the amount of times that 1 got typed in. So we're going to do that for all 4 of the potential numbers. So I'm going to say to count. All of them are going to start at 0, obviously. Okay. So now we have all of our variables declared. Let's actually make them do something now. So the way we can tell this variable to go up if the user typed in the number 1 is we say, okay, let me check whatever they typed in, and if that equals 1, then tell one count to go up. So that's going to be a matter of a few if statements, checking for some sort of condition, and then as a result, having some sort of action occur. The action in this case is telling these variables to increment by 1. But that is going to turn into a lot of if statements if we insist on writing them out over and over and over again. So we are going to create a function to take in whatever number that the user typed in and then go through a series of 4 if statements, and depending on if they typed in 1, 2, 3, or 4, tell 1 count, 2 count, 3 count, or 4 count to increment up. And then again, we're just writing the set of instructions, and then we're going to call the function after every time that the user actually types in an answer. So first off, let's start off by writing our function, writing our first set of initial instructions on just teaching our code how to increment up those variables. So I'm going to say function, and then I'm going to say check answers. That is the name of my function, and that is what I'm going to use when I want to call the set of instructions. And then inside, I'm going to say answer. Answer is the input that my function is looking for. So now whatever we type in when we're calling the function is going to be the number that we got from our prompt, whatever we inputted, whatever the user inputted. So here we're going to say, okay, if the answer that they typed in is 1, then tell 1 count to increment up. So all I have to do to say that is say 1 count plus plus. And then also, I use these curly brackets to say that this is the specific action that occur if this condition is true. That's why these curly brackets are important. So we're going to say, okay, what if they didn't type in 1? What if they typed in 2 instead? So that's going to be else. If the first condition that we checked for isn't true, check here if this condition is true. So this one's going to be answer equals equals, instead of quotations, 2. The quotations do matter, especially with all of these. And then once again, create a set of curly braces, hit enter once, and then I'm going to say tell 2 count to increment up. Saying plus plus like this is what tells the variable to add 1 to its existing total. So if 1 count was previously equal to 0, after 1 count plus plus, 1 count is equal to 1. If 1 count was previously equal to 55 for some reason, after plus plus, 1 count is going to be equal to 56. That's just what this line does. So let's get this going for the other 2 cases, 3 and 4. So else if answer equals equals 3, curly braces, hit enter once, hit tab so we indent so things are easier to read, and then I'm going to say 3 count plus plus, hit, and then end with my semicolon. And then lastly, else if, last situation we're checking for, answer equals equals 4, we are going to say 4 count plus plus. Okay, so now we've written essentially our set of instructions for our 4 if statements. Now all we have to do to actually check if what the user typed in is equal to one of these 4 numbers is now call our function. So here we're saying that our function is looking for some sort of potential input, and then once it gets that input, it can carry out whatever processes we've placed inside. Now we're actually going to give it that input and tell it to carry out said processes. So underneath line 6, I'm going to call my function to do that. I'm telling these instructions to actually run. So I'm going to say check answers because that's the name of my function. And then inside, I'm going to give it its input. What number, what input is it comparing to 1, 2, 3, and 4 to see if it matches, and then tell our variables to increment. Activity. Activity holds a number. And I'm going to end it with a semicolon. So that's what's going to get it to check. So now let's do this for all 4 of the times that we ask the user for some sort of input. So I'm going to say check answers weather. And this is where we can really see the advantage of having a function, because I only had to write out those 4 if statements one time, and now I can apply it to 4 different situations without having to write out 16 different if statements. So I'm going to say check answers, and then inside put sport. So now it's going to check if sport is equal to 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then last with food. All right, so this is what your code should look like right now. So now we have 4 values for 1 count, 2 count, 3 count, and 4 count, right? If they typed in 1 2 times out of the 4 questions, that means 1 count after all of these function calls is going to be equal to 2, right? So now we need to write a little bit of code to determine, okay, which variable out of the 4 that we incremented is the highest. The variable that is the highest is the one that the user typed in the most, right? So to do this, what we're going to do is place those 4 variables inside of an array. An array, just to review, it's a type of data structure. It's a way for us to still store pieces of information, just like a variable, but it allows us to store multiple pieces of information under one location. And then we can access those pieces of information doing some simple code and using some loops, so that again, it gives us kind of a similar advantage to functions, where we can apply one set of instructions across multiple pieces of information, and thus shortening the amount of code that you actually have to write. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var, and then here I'm going to create the name of my array. So I'm going to say answer amounts. And then here I'm going to create a set of hard brackets. It's the same key you hit for curly brackets, just don't hit shift. And then we're going to place those 4 variables we incremented here. So I'm going to say 1 count, 2 count, 3 count, and 4 count. So now each of those values are stored in one place. And the way I'm going to access my values from my array is quite simply saying, okay, you don't necessarily have to type in what I'm about to type in on line 39. I'm just trying to show you how we can access the numbers that are stored here. I can first give the name of my array, say where I'm looking to seek information from, add a set of hard brackets, and then I'm going to call the piece of information that I'm looking for as index. Now what an index is the location of the information within the array. Now the location is quite simply the order that which the object is appearing in. So my piece of information here that is the second item in my array that's how its index is going to be found. Since it's the second item, index is actually going to be equal to not 2, but 1. Now, a lot of you might be going, wait, if it's the second item, how come its index is 1? That doesn't look like it matches its location. Well, computers do this really annoying thing where we start at 0 when we begin counting. So here it would be like, I'm counting at 0, and then 1, 2, and 3. So the first item has an index of 0, the second item has an index of 1, the third item has an index of 2, and the fourth item has an index of 3. It's not a huge change, it's just a matter of starting at 0 rather than starting at 1. So if I'm trying to find say I'm trying to access whatever value that 3 count is holding, all I have to say is, okay, let me go into my array, and since I know that 3 count is the third item in my array, I know that its index is 2, so I can place that in here. And this is now going to go into 3 count and give me the information that it holds. Okay, that's just a quick little array debrief. Let's actually do something with this, right? So we've created our array, we're storing our values. Now I'm going to hit backspace a few times, and this part is written for y'all, but this is the loop that is going to move through each of these pieces in my array and determine which one holds the highest number. Now what we've done here is there is a variable that is called highest, and it's going to eventually store whichever one we determine is the largest. This is a loop. A loop is simply just going to repeat whatever instruction is placed inside a certain amount of times. In this case, it's going to run 4 times. That's what this line basically says. And then here we've said, this is how we've accessed our element from our array, answer amounts. And then here it says I instead of a number, right? So here in my for loop header, we created what we call a temporary variable. and we said I is going to be equal to 0. Okay, and so the first time this loop runs, I is equal to 0, just like we talked about. That's just it's going to replace I with 0, and it's going to say answer amounts 0. That's the first element in my array. So it's going to say, oh, is 1 count higher than 0? Because that's what highest is currently equal to. It's going to say, okay, if it is, then consider 1 count, whatever number 1 count is holding, to be considered the highest value. And then we are storing the location of it as well. So we're going to go through, and the next time this loop runs, it's going to say, okay, I'm done with whatever instruction is placed inside of my for loop. Let me go up to the top. It's going to say, okay, now I is now going to be equal to 1. So we're going to say, cool, replace this I with 1 now. Answer amounts 1. Okay, that's my second element in my array. So now we're going to say, okay, is whatever number that 2 count holds higher than whatever highest holds? And remember, here we determined highest is equal to 1 count. So we're now comparing 2 count and 1 count and saying, okay, if 2 count was higher, say 2 count held 3 and 1 count held 1, then our highest variable is now going to be equal to whatever 2 count holds. And so we kind of go through this. So let's go through this one more time. Now we finished our instruction that we placed inside of our loop, and we're going to say, okay, I is now equal to 2. Again, incrementing up that temporary variable by 1. So now again, if this I is replaced with 2, now let me access the third element in my array. So now we're going to compare, okay, is 3 count higher than what was previously considered the highest, which was what we said was 2 count, because we, again, restated this variable. We gave it a new value. And this time, let's say 3 count isn't higher than what 2 count held. So it's not going to change whatever the value that highest holds, and it's just going to go up and then check again for 4 count. And then once again, let's say, okay, I is equal to now 3. 3 is how we can figure out what element is at 3. So now let's look at the fourth and final element in my array. And then once again, let's say 4 count doesn't hold a value higher than what 2 count held, which is again, what is stored in this highest variable. And then it's going to it's just going to skip over this. And then we end up with highest at the end is considered to be whatever 2 count holds. And that is how we figured out which number got entered the most. So if you were able to kind of stick through that, it's all right. It's a hard concept, but just overall, the big picture with this is with this for loop, it runs for however many items are in this array, because that's what we've told it to. So this loop runs 4 times. And then inside, we're going to write some code to check which variable out of these 4 holds the highest number. And then whichever one has the highest number gets stored in this variable highest, which again, exiting this loop, highest will be equal to maybe 3 or 4 or something like that, because it gets redeclared to hold whatever value that one of these 4 holds. And then we can also, what's also important here is we are saving the location within our array of the highest value. So here, say 2 count was the highest value that got stored. Then we're also going to, along with storing that value that 2 count holds, we're also going to store its index within the array. So we're going to store the number 1 in highest index. So now the value 1 would necessarily get stored here. Now, the reason it's important, the reason we care about knowing the index of the highest value is because this is how we're going to figure out which user actually, or which season the user actually is. Because remember, mostly 1s means that the user chose winter, right? Mostly 2s means that the user got fall, right? So when we say we can store however many times they wrote the number 2, but the reason we're trying to store the index of whatever number got the most times, whatever value within my array is the highest, is because That is the one that we've decided is the winner. So when we are storing the location within our array of the value that got, that 1. So again, I'm going to continue with the example of, say they chose 4. We're also going to store, okay, within my array, 4 count holds the index of 3. And so that lets us know, okay, if they chose mostly 4s, I'm looking at the variable 4 count. And that's how we can kind of figure out, because there's no other way for us to just say like, if 1 count or if 2 count. We have to figure out a way to determine which value actually corresponds with which season. So we are going to say highest int equals 0. Again, because that means that what's stored at index 0? 1 count. That means that the location of the value that holds the most 1s that got typed more than 2 or 3 or 4, that is what's going to let the user know that they got winter. And then once again, if highest int, the same way that we stored the value that got the highest amount of numbers, we say, okay, which variable is that? The way we can figure out which variable is the one that got the most numbers is by looking at its index. So we're looking at its index. Oh, the variable at index number 1 is the one that got the most results from the user, and so that's what we're going to check for. The way we access the variable is by using its index, and by checking that index, we are able to give them a season that corresponds with it. So now I'm going to say alert, and then here we're going to say false. So now again, else if highest int equals 2. And then I'm going to say alert summer. And the last bit, else if highest int equals 3. And let's say alert spring. When we say alert, they're actually going to get one of those message boxes that gives them the word that we're putting inside of the alert command, and lets them know which one they got. So starting with this, let's hit run, see what we got. I'm just going to choose all 1s so I can get winter. Or you know what, we'll even do this. I'll pick 3 for the last one so we can see that this works. So I chose mostly 1s, that means the answer I get should be winter. And that's what my alert box gives me. Now the last bit we got to do here is I want all of those values that I typed in to be ultimately outputted here on this panel. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to go back a little. So right on line 37 above var answer amounts where we've stored how many times each number got chosen, I'm also going to create an object. Now an object is just another way for us to store and access information. And so what we're going to do is create an object called var user. I'm going to say equals, and then I'm going to create a set of curly brackets. And then here I'm going to say, okay, for the first question, let me store what answer they got there. And then for the second question, let me store what answer they got. So to do this, I'm going to type in first. So that's me saying, okay, I'm storing something under the key of first, and then I'm going to give it a value. The value is going to be whatever answer they got. In this case, it's going to be activity, right? That's the place that we're storing what they got for that. So I'm going to say activity. So now, if I wanted to access this value that activity holds, I could just say, okay, go into the place that I created my variable of user, and then access whatever it holds under first. So let's do it for second as well. What did they get for the second one? That would be weather, whatever the variable weather holds. And the next one is going to be third, and it's going to be sport. And the last one is going to be fourth, food. Now, the advantage of doing this is because, say we wanted at some point, maybe you're trying to make this a little more complex later, and we wanted to say that the user chose a different activity for some reason, all you'd really have to do is, you can change what that value is equal to and store it somewhere under saying the user still chose a different activity, or the user still chose an activity, it's just, I don't know, gardening instead of snowboarding, which is what they originally chose. I'm saying this gives you the flexibility to necessarily change what these values hold. So we've stored what the user chose and for which one they chose it for. Now let's actually access them. So the way you're going to do that is simply by saying, okay, let me get what my object was, which is user. That's the name of it. I'm going to say user dot first. So that's saying access whatever value is held under first, which is activity. So if I want this to actually get printed out, I have to say document dot get element by ID, and I'm going to create a set of open and closing brackets. And then I'll tell you all what goes in there in a second, but then I'm going to say inner HTML equals, and that's where you end it with user.first. Now what this whole big chunky line does is it says insert whatever value is on the other side of my equal sign into my panel by basically, this is how you can get JavaScript and HTML to quote unquote like collaborate. But here's the thing. It needs to know where in your HTML code it needs to insert it. Is it above your images? Is it above your heading? Is it underneath your button? Where is it, right? So to do this, let's go back into HTML. And then underneath our button portion, we're going to say that less than symbol. And I'm going to say div. And I'm going to close it. So I get those two tags. This is how you're going to create kind of what's like a placeholder within your HTML code. And it's going to be waiting for whatever you're going to insert in it using JavaScript. So I'm going to say inside of my first opening tag for divide, I'm going to say ID equals, the first one is going to be, I want a placeholder to insert whatever activity that they did, right? So I'm going to say activity. So now I'm creating a placeholder in my HTML that which I can insert whatever information from my JavaScript was there. So inside of those open and closing parentheses you created, you're going to use your open and closing quotes and say activity. So now you're letting it know, okay, where should I insert this? Okay, underneath all my buttons because I created a divide that said activity, and then inside of that quote unquote placeholder should be whatever the user chose for their first answer. So let's hit run, see what this looks like. I'm just going to hit 1. Okay. I got winter because I mostly chose 1. And now what I got for my first answer was 1. Now to make this look a little better, we are going to add quotations around this. And we're going to say activity. And then say plus like this. So add some text inside of quotations, add a plus after it, and then have user.first. So now we're going to have the word activity appear before 1, so we know that, okay, that's their answer to the activity question. So now we have the word activity appearing. So now I'm going to type it out again to show y'all. So this time let's get the user's weather choice appearing. So I'm going to say document.getElement. Your capitalization does matter, so make sure you're capitalizing every word after get with its first letter. And then here, again, we need to create some sort of placeholder. So now I'm going to go back into HTML. I'm going to say div inside of that less than. I hit backspace a few times. Just so it's all fitting like that on one line. It doesn't make a difference, but I like the way it looks better. So here again, inside of that opening tag. So it's not in between, it's right here. I'm saying ID equals, this time let's give it the ID of weather. This is how we can identify that placeholder again. So let's go back into JavaScript, scroll down, and then I'm going to get element by ID weather. I'm going to say dot inner HTML. And then this time, let's say weather. Add my plus, because I'm bringing in 2 different pieces of information on one line, and I'm going to say user dot second, because now I'm going into my user object that I created, And now I'm trying to access whatever value is stored under that key of second. So let's now let's create 2 more placeholders. I'm just going to do this at once now. So I'm going to say div. Inside say ID equals. This time let's give it the ID of sport. And then let's get one more placeholder in there, div. Then inside I say ID equals food for the last one. Cool. So now once again, document.getElement by ID. Inside, looking for sport. That's where our placeholder is. Inner HTML, saying that is how we can actually get it appearing. Whatever the user chose for their sport, giving it some text beforehand, adding our plus symbol because we're combining 2 pieces of information, and I say user.third. And last but not least, document.getElement by ID. Careful of my capitalization and my spelling. I'm going to say food. Inner HTML equals food to give it some sort of title. And then lastly, getting the 4th element stored in my object. Now, before I hit run again, there's one last thing. You might be noticing that this whole box goes gray, and that's fine. It's doing that because our prompts are running, and then once our prompts are done running, everything appears. That's not how we want this game to work, though. We want the user to only get those prompt messages after they click on Start Quiz, right? So what we're going to do is put this whole thing, all of our code inside of our JavaScript portion, inside of a function. And then we're going to call that function, and we're going to say, this function should run only when this button is clicked. If the button isn't clicked, our function won't run, which means none of the prompts we place inside will run, which means that you won't get those prompt messages until the user actually clicks on their button. So here we're going to say function, and then we're going to say start quiz for the name of it. Oopsies. And then I'm going to say open and close. Remember, this is still in your JavaScript portion. And then what you're going to do is create your opening curly brace and then delete the closing one until you scroll all the way to the bottom, all of your code. And then underneath, I'm going to add my closing curly brace. That means all of this is inside of this function and won't run until that function is called. So now we're heading back to our button tag in HTML. I'm going to say button on click equals. On click is what tells our button to run something when it gets clicked on click. And then I'm going to say inside of quotations, my function's name, which is start quiz opening and closing parentheses. So now let's hit run. Now I don't immediately get those prompt boxes. Let me click on start quiz. There's my first one. I'm going to pick 3, hit OK. Now I'm going to pick 3 again. Let's pick 4, see some variety. And then I'll pick 1 here. So I know that my answer, I mostly chose 3s, so I should be getting summer, which I did. Now let me hit OK. And now I get exactly my values. And you can also see, one kind of corresponds with the first image, which is the picture of winter. The next one is fall, summer is 3, and spring is 4. But at this point, your game is all done, and congratulations on earning your 3rd Coding for Good badge.